Cezanne is one of those artists who bring forward into art an entire new way of proceeding, of looking, of making, of thinking. So it's really important to understand what a monumental figure he is, who exerts a massive influence on 20th century painting, and why he's such a monumental figure. Here he is looking at you from a self-portrait painted very early on in his painting career, 1862 to 64. And the arc of his painting career is interesting because he begins at this point as something of an artistic misfit. He makes odd paintings. This one is so stark and dark, powerful, but a little bit clumsy in an interesting way. These odd paintings had a dark palette, often a dark theme or mood. And then what happens? He begins to work closely with Pissarro, one of the leading figures in Impressionism, and to become affiliated with the Impressionist group. Pissarro essentially becomes a mentor to Cezanne. They go out into the landscape to paint together en plein air. And Pissarro's work catalyzes a complete change in Cezanne's way of painting. This particular landscape that you're looking at is by Pissarro, and it's a good example of the way that Pissarro's paintings helped to redirect Cezanne's thinking. Notice how complex the spatial relations are, with the trees in the foreground screening the houses in the background. Notice the palette, full of warm greens and golds, touches of terracotta orange red, daubs of blue, a very impressionist palette of pure color. And the first signs of change in Cezanne's painting are his different colors that he begins using, lighter, brighter colors that show the influence of Impressionism and Pissarro. And also the brushwork, which is laid down now in visible touches. At this point, Cezanne is affiliated with the Impressionists, but not really in alignment with their mandate to paint contemporary urban life. You're looking at nudes in a landscape, and it has nothing to do with the commitment to contemporaneity that Baudelaire spoke of when he said, "Il faut être de son temps," one must be of one's time. This painting is not of Cezanne's time in any clear way. The modern women of Haussmann's Paris did not go around bathing naked in local ponds and lakes. What Cezanne is doing is creating a kind of a fantasy of what we could call Arcadia, a kind of a idyllic world of pleasure and harmony, a fantasy world where nymphs cavort in some idealized natural splendor. That kind of subject harks back to academic painting with its images of Venus and classical figures in kind of golden age beauty. And Cezanne does express an interest in what he calls creating out of Impressionism an art that is more permanent and durable, like the art of the museums. Ultimately, that means for him a return to two of the most old-fashioned and humble genres, landscape and still life. His mature work evolved as a series of studies of the local landscapes around his home in the Provence region of Paris. Interestingly, he states in this quote his goal in painting the places, the landscapes around him, such as Mont Saint-Victoire, which you see in this photograph, and you see Cezanne's rendering of it. He wanted not merely to depict nature as it's seen through the eye. He wanted instead to create a harmony parallel to nature. That's interesting because Cezanne very famously said of Monet that Monet was a great painter, but he was only an eye. But what an eye. As if saying, implicitly critiquing an impressionist like Monet for being tied closely to the appearances, the shifting appearances of the world, when Cezanne is going to want to step back and construct a painting that responds to the world, but on its own terms as a painting. We can see this in the way he constructs his still life paintings. So he's assembling objects, draperies, cloths, plates, fruit, pears, eggplants, jars, domestic objects of the kitchen. But what is he doing in terms of painting style? He's using traditional modeling, light and shadow, but he's actually breaking down the idea that light and shadow will construct a consistently illusionistic world, parallel to ordinary space. He's disturbing the spatial field with shifting angles and planes that make space dynamic and complex. The green pot, the melon, seem to be viewed mostly head-on, along with this pot with the cords. But the plate of pears is seen from a different angle, sort of above, but also tipped, as if we are looking at this still life in a mobile way, shifting and moving, and looking at the dynamic nature of perception. This is different than an impressionist like Mary Cassatt. This wonderful painting is a still life, lilacs in a pot at a windowsill. And her spatial vantage point is interesting. The pot is set at an angle to the open window. So we get strong diagonals, creating dynamism. But Mary Cassatt wants to keep everything consistent in its own spatial envelope. Cezanne does not. He purposely introduces inconsistencies, notes of jarring push and pull. He does not want a single stable space. He wants the painting to oscillate between three-dimensional and two-dimensional elements, using incremental brush marks to define space, but also to indicate flatness. This is what gives us a push of near and far. We wind up seeing some things like these biscuits or pieces of bread or madeleines from a different angle than we are seeing this fruit, this apple. Look at this beautiful still life by Shardon from the 18th century. All of the objects are lined up firmly on the table, placed in a consistent spatial depth. Everything is related in a unified spatial field that allows the viewer to believe in the painting as a window onto an illusionistic world. Cezanne ruptures that consistency, and we don't entirely believe in a unified world. Instead, we're seeing this sense of viewing as a push and pull. We're seeing an arrangement. We're seeing marks that indicate flatness, some that indicate depth. We are engaged actually in intense scrutiny of the act of building an illusion using colored marks and strokes. So the brushwork simultaneously reveals the constructing of an illusion, the constructing of a sense of the deep layers of green and brighter layers of green that make up a forest, but it also deconstructs the illusion as we see these marks on the surface of the canvas, asserting the flatness of the canvas. We get attention to the elements of painting as a visual language on their own. We also get these interesting effects of paradox and ambiguity, such as this marvelous moment of the stone bridge being reflected in the water so that we have this kind of very firm sense of a circle drawn on the surface, but then we get this depth of the darks behind. And we have this kind of oscillation between a sense of a very methodical procedure, as if he's proceeding systematically and logically, versus a shifting and intuitive response. This comes across very vividly in his late landscapes. This painting of Mont Saint-Victoire makes it so clear that each dab of color is indicating a spatial shift. This dark green against this medium green against the bright, and then the intervention of the yellow. At the same time, we are so aware of each of those as being laid on the flat surface of the two-dimensional canvas. So again, we're seeing the illusion of space constructed and deconstructed mark by mark. This is what leads Cezanne to being the inspiration for what becomes Cubism. Cezanne is drawing attention to the medium of paint and the means of making an image. In doing so, he's undercutting the very idea of painting as a window onto an illusionistic world, which had been the guiding principle of Western painting since the invention of one-point linear perspective in the 1400s. It's now the beginning of the 1900s. Cezanne is turning the corner onto what will become an entirely different concept of painting. And that will be a concept taken up by the foremost painters of the early 20th century, Picasso and Braque, who together collaborate at developing Cubism as a response to Cezanne, where they will be now redefining painting in terms of abstraction, surface, mark making, attention to the procedures of painting, and a dynamic interplay of space and time.